When people ask, "Where are you from?" I sometimes want to say, well, buckle up. This is a long story. I was born here in Northern California, and then when I was a little girl, my family moved to the Western Pacific to Micronesia. And then I went to grade school and high school in Hawaii. And since then, I have lived in 3 or 4 different places in California, plus Seattle, Boston, Connecticut, and St. Louis, not necessarily in that order. And that doesn't include the year I spent studying abroad in Scotland during college. Today, I work in Davis, but I live in rural Yolo County in a town called Dunnigan. The population is 1,300 people, and the elevation is 69 feet above sea level. So don't worry if you have not heard of it. As they say, it's complicated. I'm not sure that the people who wrote the Bible, either the Old or the New Testaments, could have imagined a life like the one that I have lived. For most of human history, people didn't stray that far from where they were born, unless it was for specific migratory purposes having to do with climate, food, and other resource issues. And even then, they probably did it in groups, not individually. But today, people move all the time. We move for schools, for jobs, for relationships, and even just because it seems like some particular locale will suit us a little better. And that's not even to speak of the people who are forced to leave their homes because they're not safe due to climate change, war, political unrest, or some other systemic violence. Our sense of as place, as specific and particular, as intimately known and worthy of love and protection, has eroded due to all of this mobility, much to the detriment of our sense of community, stability, and even, I would argue, our relationship with God. To be clear, I don't regret any of the moves I've made, even those that were difficult or lonely. Having to adapt to new people and places is an important skill set. And I know I have been lucky to live in such beautiful and interesting places. But there is a trade-off. More and more, I'm convinced that if you are not rooted in place, you still have to be rooted in something. Had I not had the something of the church as an anchor point in my life, I think the absence of a strong sense of place, of belonging to a place, would have been much more detrimental. But still, sometimes I miss the intimate knowledge of a particular community's history, landscape, and local culture that comes from living in one place for many years, or even better, many generations. I'm thinking about all this in part because the church has just celebrated the minor liturgical season of Rogation Tide, the 3 days before the Feast of the Ascension that are traditionally associated with litanies and processions that ask for God's blessing on fields, crops, and the weather in hopes of a fruitful and abundant growing season. This is a time when the church does get very particular about place, especially in that great old medieval tradition of beating the bounds, blessing the land, and marking its limits before God and everyone. This is one of my favorite times in the liturgical year, a time when we remember that all land and everything on it is a gift from God, and that we are as dependent on its flourishing as every generation of humankind before us. I'm also thinking about place and how it shapes us because of today's psalm and what it says to us about the connection between land and God and one another. There are definitely some images in this psalm that come from a cosmology, a worldview that will feel pretty foreign to us. For instance, God is pictured as riding in the heavens and also as intervening quite directly in the world, scattering enemies before him and marching through the wilderness. Storms and earthquakes are understood as being caused by God's physical presence. Yet, throughout this psalm, there is also a beautiful sense that God cares very much about where people are placed, about how our location both shapes and responds to the kind of people we are and who we might become. The psalm calls out to God in your holy places or in your habitation, as if the author cannot imagine that God would not have a place to call God's own. At the same time, God does not use that place or places to retreat from us, but instead is intimately involved in our cares and concerns. The psalmist understands God as the guardian of widows and orphans, a God of justice and loving kindness, a God who shows compassion on prisoners and the poor, on the lonely and the vulnerable. It's critically important that we recognize that this care and compassion is not vague or general or disembodied. The specific way that God cares for people, according to the psalmist, is by giving them a place to live and prosper. God gives a home to the solitary and makes the land inhabitable for those who would otherwise have no home. Furthermore, the land itself is the subject of God's care and compassion. In line 9, the psalmist rejoices, "You sent a gracious rain, O God, upon your inheritance. You refreshed the land when it was weary." God refreshed the land when it was weary. Not just the people who live on that land, but the land itself. I love to think of God's tender compassion, not just to human beings, those of us who have the immense privilege of being made in the image and likeness of God, but also to all creatures, great and small, plant and animal, and even the land itself, which Aldo Leopold memorably called the great biotic community. Remembering that our place, where God has placed us, is local and specific, is good, important work for our bodies and our souls. It should remind us that caring for where we live is part of what it means to be a good Christian, a good person, and a good neighbor. At this moment in human and planetary history, though, we have a further moral imperative, one more thing to remember. We know that all of life on this planet is interconnected in important ways. So what we do here in Northern California, how we live our lives day to day, can change the lives of people and plants and even ocean levels in far-flung parts of the globe. No matter how much we move around or think we have lost our connection to the land, there's a growing understanding that our dependence on the natural world is of profound emotional and spiritual significance, as well as just being an inescapable physical reality. The philosopher James R. Martin, in an essay exploring the connection between being at home in the world and our ability to find deep rest and renewal, writes, "I'm thinking about belonging. I'm thinking about solidarity and hospitality. It isn't enough merely to belong with our fellow humans in our neighborhoods. We must belong also with the butterflies, the earthworms, the trees, the water, the lizards, the honeybees, all of the life around us, which are beings in our neighborhood. That is to say, they are our neighbors. To the extent that neighborliness is a variation on the theme of hospitality, to have deep rest and to belong is to become neighbors with all of the nearby living. He concludes, to belong is to be a neighbor, to be alive, to live. But to be fully alive is an act of generosity, of kindness, of love. Being fully alive is an act of generosity, of kindness, and of love. In the end, perhaps what matters more than where we are from is that we choose to be fully alive where we are now. That is the best first step to being a good neighbor to our fellow creatures, human and non-human alike, so that we can all flourish, rooted and grounded in God's love. In the beginning, God saw what God had made and said that it was good. At the time of the incarnation, God so loved the world, the cosmos, the whole world, that God gave us Jesus to be a part of it and to give himself to it and for it. And now, during Ascension Tide, God goes ahead of us, making a place for us, because we never stop mattering to God, and God never wants us to be without a place that God has chosen and prepared for us. Amen.